Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. We're into the 4th week of Aetherdrift, and every Monday I like to do my best of 1, best of 3 meta review. And best of 1 will be covering some of the best decks from Diamond to Mythic according to Untapped, which is a third-party tracker, and is a way I can kind of remove my bias. Last week, though, was kind of the season reset, so this is the very early data for Diamond and Mythic, so keep that in mind that this is a somewhat small sample size compared to later on. But I do think the decks looked particularly good, and I will also be covering the best of 3 meta, going over some of the tournament winners in the Standard Challenge, and just kind of talking about, what changes we've seen throughout the weeks, why we're seeing them, that sort of thing. So I also wanted to say really quickly thank you to all of my YouTube members, but especially Strider Rules. Thank you for becoming my very first All-Star MVP. I really appreciate it. It was I'm just very thankful. I'm without words, so thank you. Because, the amount of time and energy that I put into this is really a passion project because of how much I love Magic the Gathering. It is not a cash grab, right? Like, in my 5 years of doing this, it'll be 5 years this June. I've made $4,000, and that includes everything with YouTube, with Twitch, all of that, right? So if we're looking at less than $1 an hour, right? And but I do enjoy helping people out, helping people enjoy Magic the Gathering, welcoming people back. Right, I think Magic the Gathering has an amazing community. It's got a couple of people who are not so great, but within that, there is some really good stuff. So thank you for everybody throughout the years who have joined my community and, made the Gathering part of Magic the Gathering what it is. So with that, though, let's get into the decks. So this is Azorius Omniscience. It's the only tier 1 deck according to the tracker, same as last week. This deck is a combo deck, and it is maybe being a little bit problematic. It's not to the point where I think it needs a ban, but it's starting maybe to get a little bit too good. And so this week, what we see, if we compare it to last week, we see that they dropped the Seachrome Coast, dropped 1 Invasion of Arcavios, which I kind of like, because if you have multiple copies of Invasion of Arcavios in hand, it can be a problem. You do need to eventually hit this for the combo, but if you have 3 copies in hand, you don't need multiple copies, you just need 1. So since we've increased the ability to dig, I kind of like dropping the Invasion of Arcavios down 1. We're also dropping a Confounding Riddle, which is a way to dig for the Invasion of Arcavios, and we're dropping the 3 Conduit Pylons, which is the untapped land that can surveil, which is a way to kind of hit the Omniscience into your graveyard. And we're dropping all 4 copies of the Fabled Passage, which is the one that if there's 4 or more lands, you can thin your deck, which is a way to get lands out of the way. And we're also dropping 2 copies of the Founding of the Third Path, so we're just getting rid of the Founding of the Third Path entirely. And we're dropping 2 Soul Partitions, which was the 1 and a white for instant speed removal. Dropping 2 Refutes, and when you're in the mirror match, it actually is kind of handy to have the counterspell. I've found, at least. But you still have the Confounding Riddle as well. And we're dropping Jace. And Jace kind of speeds things up if you're doing the Breach the Multiverse way to win in the sideboard. This one is doing the Heroic Reinforcements instead. But either way, infinite loop, win the game, right? So, and in its place, we're putting in 2 more islands. We're putting in a full playset of Chart a Course. I like this, because the point of this is that we're going to try to dig into Omniscience into our hand, not into our graveyard, and then we can use Chart a Course to discard it. We can also hit it into the graveyard, don't get me wrong, but there's a little bit more of that going on in this, where we're going to lean more heavily into the Chart Up to bring in the stock ups. Chart a Course. And we're bringing in 3 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. This one helps out against the early aggression and is one of the better cards in your opening hand, so that you can survive out against mono red and Boros Auras and things like that. So part of why we're tweaking the deck the way that we are doing is to try to improve its matchups in its worst possible scenario, which is mono red aggro and Rakdos Aggro. So we're bringing, similar to that front, we're bringing in 2 copies of the Blast Zone, which at least gives us kind of a Hail Mary. I won one game earlier today off of having the Blast Zones to be able to kind of negate Rakdos Aggro on mana value 2. And we've also got one additional Moment of Truth, which is the, for digging, that you can also put something into the graveyard. Sorry, I apologize, it's been a really long day. Let's see, we've got the 4th copy of the Meticulous Archive. We've got 3 copies of the Darker Wastes. I like the Darker Wastes in here because I have had moments where I was not, able to hit the white, and especially if we're going to play Temporary Lockdown with the double pip whites, we need more flexibility, especially because we're bringing in the Blast Zones. So I like the Darker Wastes. And then we have the 3 copies of the Stock Up. And we've seen Stock Up being played in best of 3, and usually what happens in best of 3 then trickles down into best of 1 if we give it enough time, which is partly why I cover both best of 1 and best of 3. And so we have seen Stock Up in this archetype in best of 3, and now we're seeing it in best of 1. The downside with this card is that it doesn't fill your graveyard. The upside to this card, though, is that it digs for 5 if you are already doing the Omniscience loop and looking for your Invasion of Arcavios. If you are completely unsure how this deck actually wins, I do have a video on it, and it's a very similar strategy whether or not you're running the Heroic Reinforcements or Breach the Multiverse. You're playing an Invasion of Arcavios, you're getting Beseech the Mirror, you're grabbing a 2nd copy of Invasion of Arcavios, you're grabbing This Town Ain't Big Enough. That then allows you to loop any spell in the sideboard infinitely. So you grab your Season of Weaving to make dudes and bounce everything, Heroic Reinforcements to just make infinite amounts of soldiers that get +1/+1 in haste each time that you go through the loop. The Day of Judgment and Negate and Sunder the Gateway, these don't come up terribly often. Sometimes when you're playing up against like a control matchup, you'll want to grab the Negate so that when you slam the Abuelo's Awakening with the Omniscience, you can then have a Negate in hand. It's a way to make the Invasion of Arcavios, if you have duplicates in your hand, more relevant. And then Sunder the Gateways in here if they have something like Rest in Peace, the white enchantments that gets rid of graveyards, or if they have something like the Ghost Vacuum, where you have something that's going to interrupt your Omniscience in your graveyard. You then have to play the Invasion of Arcavios to go grab that and reset that. Day of Judgment, I suppose, is for some sort of problematic board state, but I can't imagine ever actually wanting to grab it. But Season of Weaving works because it return each non-land, non-token permanent, and the Omniscience that's reanimated from Abuelo's Awakening is a token. So it doesn't bounce your Omniscience from the board, but allows you to replay the Invasion of Arcavios and draw cards and all that stuff. Create infinite copies of your 1/1s, whatever. Right. So anyway, that was a long, kind of winded one. I'll try to be a little bit faster on the other ones. Oh, but before that, let me just talk really quickly about the matchups. So this deck is favored against Azorius Control, which actually surprised me a little bit, but then I thought about it, like, counterspells do interrupt the combo, but like you can hit the combo again, so eventually you kind of just exhaust them from always having an answer. It's favored against mono black midrange, Esper Self-Bounce, not really having any creatures for the plethora of removal to have good targets. It's also favored against Boros Auras. And then it is a coin flip against mono red aggro. And so the temporary lockdown helps out against the Boros Auras matchup. It helps make a coin flip against mono red aggro instead of it being weak. And so we do see an improvement there this week. So I do like this build, increasing its matchup against mono red. And then it's weak against Rakdos Aggro. The other thing that I like to do each week is talk about the top performing cards in your opening hand. So for this build, we're looking for Temporary Lockdown, Abuelo's Awakening, Philology Archaeologist, and Chart a Course. So, if you do like these things every week, you like to listen to my ramblings, do consider becoming a YouTube member. It is the best way to help support me, and I appreciate those who do. So number 2 here is Rakdos Aggro, and this is the top of tier 2. And this is the one deck that is the Azorius Omniscience is weak 2, right? So this is the counter to the top of the meta. And this has no changes from week 3. So we're going to kind of breeze through this one and assume that you've heard about it before. It's favored against mono red aggro and Azorius Omniscience. Its opening hand, you're looking for Monstrous Rage, the Callous Sellsword, the Heartfire Hero, and the Emberheart Challenger. and you're trying to get a turn 3 win. Okay, number 3 is Mono Red Aggro in Tier 2, and if we compare this to Week 3, we see that we've dropped a single Soulstone Sanctuary to bring in a third copy of the Witchstalker Frenzy. And I think that 3 is a little bit much. I think 2 makes sense. It does extend in certain matchups, helps you play around the Wraths, Temporary Lockdown, and such. This deck is favored against Domain. That's really the one that it's countering the best right now on the main meta. It's a coin flip against Azorius Omniscience, Azorius Control, and Esper Self-Bounce. So if you have some just like you want some quick matches that are coin flips as a way to climb the ladder, Mono Red is definitely a good way to do it. It's weak against Mono Black mid-range, where the single point interaction or the removal slows it down. The Boros Auras is also difficult, depending on whether or not you have the Burst Lightning or Shock to hit the target of the Sheltered by Ghosts. And then it's weak to Rakdos Aggro, kind of by design, because you're playing a disruptive aggro strategy, whereas Rakdos Aggro is a pure aggro strategy that doesn't bring in non-linear disruptive elements like Burst Lightning or Lightning Strike. And then it is also weak to Mardu Aggro, which is Boros Auras with the fling, with the cacophony, with the Calisel Sword. So the opening hand for this one is the mouse package. You're looking for the Manifold Mouse, the Heartfire Hero, Hired Claw gets thrown in there too. It's good to start on turn 1, and this is a good card to do that. And then the Emberheart Challenger as well. All right. Number 4 is Azorius Control, and this one is climbed up the it's starting to rear its head, which is usually Control takes a little while to show up. Sometimes, very rarely, we have like day 1 Control, right? Usually you have to kind of wait a little bit for the Control meta to catch up and be able to answer all of the threats that make up the meta. So this one is number 4. It was number 8 last week, so we see a pretty good climb of Azorius Control throughout the weeks. And if we compare this one to week 3, we see that they dropped a Plains, a Blast Zone, and a Fountain Port, and the 2 Overlord of the Mistmoors, and the 1 copy of the Sunfall. And instead we're running an island, a 4th copy of the Temporary Lockdown, the Seachrome Coast, a 1 of the Rest in Peace to disrupt like the Azorius Omniscience, and the Restless Anchorage, up to 4 copies for the Manlands, and then 1 copy of the 3 Steps Ahead. So this is pretty similar to what we saw in the Worlds build with the Overlord of the Mistmoors. I think is coming in from Worlds build that Arne had, and this strategy is favored against Mono Black midrange and Esper Self-Bounce. So if you're coming up against a lot of those removal decks, then Azorius Control is a really good option for that. It's a coin flip against against Mono Red Aggro, but it's an unfavorable coin flip. But it's close to 50%, and but it's weak against Azorius Omniscience. So part of that is because the Azorius Control strategy wins through mill, and to start milling them enables their combo, right? But you do have disruption like the No More Lies, the Negate, and the 3 Steps Ahead. It's just you don't have a whole ton of counter spells. It hasn't been a very popular build to have just the ton of counter spells, because when you're playing it control against control, when you're playing against the mirror match comes down to who the person who has the most amount of counter spells wins the game, right? And cards like Day of Judgment then feel worse in the mirror match. But because Azorius Control is new to the meta, it's not like before rotation where we saw like a very control versus control meta, if that makes sense, right? So the opening hand for this one, though, you are looking for your Temporary Lockdown, way to survive that early aggression from Mono Red Aggro, and then No More Lies. But do keep in mind that Control does not want to mulligan as much as an aggro strategy does. So be a little bit more flexible with your opening hand. All right, number 5 here, according to Untapped, is Boros Auras. And if we compare this one to last week, we see that they dropped a Mountain, the Demonic Ruckus, and the 3 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear to then bring back the Atali's Favor. So we kind of see this back and forth each week, whether or not you're running the Atali's Favor list or the one that's not running the Atali's Favor. If you are running the Atali's Favor, then you need to up the lands. So we're bringing in 2 Thran portals and then the Feather of Flight. So this strategy has fallen out of popularity a little bit because of it being countered pretty hard by Nowhere to Run in both mono red mid-range and Esper Self-Bounce. But it is favored against mono red aggro. So if we see a return to, that's the most popular archetype on the ladder is mono red. So this kind of preys on that. It's weak against Azorius Omniscience though, and I think that's a problem going forward, just judging by that one and its performance. The opening hand, you're looking for the Sheltered by Ghosts, Heartfire Hero, Ethereal Armor, and the Optimistic Scavenger. All right, number 6 is Mono Red Goblins, and we're still seeing some innovation, and we haven't settled on the best build for this one, although we're starting to see maybe a little bit more of the Goblin-centric builds taking over rather than the 4 Krankos. So if we compare this one to last week, we see that they've dropped 2 copies of Krenko. We're dropping 1 copy of the Burst Lightning, bringing in 2 less of the Grease Wrench Goblins, which have performed really quite well in the opening hand. So I'm not sure I'm agree with that, but again, this is to remove my bias. We've dropped 2 copies of the Draconautics Engineer. If you're going to play more Krankos, we've been seeing more copies of the Draconautics Engineer to give it haste. And then we have 4 copies of the Fanatical Firebrand being dropped, and kind of leaning away from the speed build. So we're dropping 4 copies of the Amonkhet Raceway, the 2 copies of the Agatha's Soul Cauldron, which goes with the Krenko, and then the 3 Tree City was being explored as a one of last week. So this week we've got 3 mountains, bringing in 2 Frenzied Goblins. I explored Frenzied Goblins in Foundations and was not impressed, so I'm not sold on the Frenzied Goblin tier. We've also got 2 copies of the Cavern of Souls, 1 copy of Squee. Sometimes we see Squee included, sometimes not. Cacophony Scamp. I like the Cacophony Scamp in the builds that are running the Lords. So if you look at my Mono Red Goblins build, I ran the Horde Master as well as the Dropkick Bomber, and I think that helps improve the Scamp to make it a little bit more of a threat to enable your Seer Slicer Goblin. Monstrous Rage was one that I haven't seen included, but it's a really good combat trick, so it might as well be included. And then we have 2 copies of the Dropkick Bomber. So this specific build has too low of data for matchups, but as I've mentioned throughout the weeks, the mono red or the mono black strategy is kind of getting punished by the go wide build, but that's if you're leaning more heavily into Krenko. So we'll have more information on this as we get into kind of a more set made as there's more alignment into the direction of mono red goblins, then I'll have a better way of speaking to its matchups. But the opening hand, your 1-drops have been performing really well. Like Grease Wrench Goblin is at the top of the list, followed by the Burnout Bastronaut and the Cacophony Scamp. So I like the inclusion of the Cacophony Scamp here. And then the Rune Volt Horde Master has been a particularly nice follow-up to your turn 1 play. All right, and number 7 is Mardu Aggro, and this is what I was talking about, is it's Boros Auras with the Callous Sellsword. This one is going a little bit more towards what we used to call the Boros Burn deck, and so if we compare this one to week 1 of Aetherdrift, then we can see that we dropped 2 mountains, we dropped a Callous Sellsword, and we dropped the 4 copies of the Feather of Flight to bring in 2 copies of the Boros Charm, 2 copies of the Rock Face Village, and 3 copies of the Burst Lightning. So a little bit more direct damage, a little bit less into the fling than what we've usually seen in the Mardu Aggro build. And again, this one is low data for matchups for this specific one, but it has a very similar build to Boros Auras, and so your matchups should be similar to that. And the opening hand, you're looking for the Sheltered by Ghosts, the Heartfire Hero, the Manifold Mouse, and the Emberheart Challenger. And in last place is Esper Self-Bounce. Not at last place, but this one is the only deck this week that was in Tier 3. Again, we have a limited amount of data, so Esper Self-Bounce is usually in Tier 2, but if we compare this, it's in Tier 2, but it's hardly ever in the top 8. And so we have to go all the way back to the end of Foundations to talk about Esper Self-Bounce, which a month ago was kind of like the most popular deck. It was trending, if you will. And so if we compare it to that list, we see that they dropped the Caves of Kolios, the Underground River, and the Darker Wastes. just to make some changes to the lands. And then this list is not running the 4 copies of the Spiteful Hexmage, which helps out against the mono red build, and is dropping the 4 copies of the Sheltered by Ghosts, which also helps out against the mono red build. So the previous list in week 12 of Foundations might be a better list if you're bumping into a lot of mono red. This one is bringing in a plains and an island and a swamp, so she'll just have some of the basics so that if you do get hit by the demolition field, then you're not just left with it being a stone rain. And we've also got the Go for the Throat coming in here. We've got 1 copy of Destroy Evil, more common in best of 3 than in best of 1 in my opinion. We've got the 2 copies of the Restless Anchorage, and we're bringing in a additional copy of Kaido, Bane of Nightmares. Again, this is worse off in the aggro matchups, so in best of 1 you usually see a decrease in the number of Kaido. And then we've got 1 copy of Overlord of the Baelmerk, and which has the enchantment synergies with the deck and can help you bring stuff back. We've got the 1 copy of the Momentum Breaker, which also has the enchantment synergies, and then we have 2 copies of Spell Pierce. And so this one is set up, I think, a little bit in, it's a unique approach that I think it brings in a lot of elements that we've seen more commonly in best of 3, right? And like, it's running the 4 copies of the Stormchaser's Talent, which I've mentioned is worse in best of 1. It's common to see this in best of 3. So this build is a coin flip against mono red aggro and mono black midrange, and it's weak to Azorius Omniscience and Azorius Control. So it's not particularly well positioned in the meta. But something's gotta be number 8. Okay, and now for best of 3. So in best of 3, I like to look at the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. It's a very good tournament. We have lots of really good players in that tournament, and I think it does a decent job of kind of speaking to what's happening in best of 3, right? And the other thing too is that it's nice to kind of mention something that maybe more reflecting your experience in paper than what happens on Arena, because Arena and paper tournaments are, in RCQ is not necessarily going to be the same meta, so keep that in mind. So this is the first place winner from the standard challenge on March 7th is Azorius Omniscience by San Pop. And if we compare this to the last week of Foundations, which was the last time we saw it take down a number 1 or number 2 first place or second place, we see some changes. So we have dropped a Charter Course, dropped the Invasion of Arcavios, dropped the Picklock Prankster, dropped a Confounding Riddle, as far as Dispersal, 2 Fabled Passages, and 2 Conduit Pylons to bring in a Island and a Plains and 2 Temporary Lockdowns. So we're starting to see kind of why the best of 1 deck is looking the way that it is looking a lot more like the best of 3 build, minus the Picklock Prankster. And we also see an additional Seachrome Coast, the Flood Farm Verge, and then the 3 stock-ups. So I think the stock-ups are here to stay. I think they're looking pretty good. I played with them today. It's a little bit different. You have to get used to it. But I think that, it's a fun one in best of 1 or best of 3. It's not as good in best of 3 as it is in best of 1 because it is a lot easier to sideboard against. But this one's coming up with some, interesting solutions to that problem. So we're dropping a Temporary Lockdown, we're dropping the Defabricate, we're dropping an Unnerving Grasp, which is a way to kind of do an infinite loop that uses your deck, and Heroic Reinforcements is just better. We're dropping the 2 Minor Missteps and the 2 Exercise, and we're bringing in a additional copy of the Negate, because again, if one of the ways that you lose is that you use the Boiler's Awakening on the Omniscience, and then they have having a negate is handy to keep that line safe. We have the Johann Stopgap, which I've seen more and more people running the Johann Stopgap. It's nice to be able to bounce your own Invasion of Arcavios back to your hand sometimes if you had to play it out earlier. It's just nice to have as an option. And then we've got the 2 copies of Get Lost for some enchantment hate instead of the Exercise, basically. Exercise can hit artifacts. And then we have the 3 copies of the Riptide Gear Hulk. And what you're doing with the Riptide Gear Hulk is you're giving yourself an alternative option for winning the game outside of the Omniscience loop. right? You can instead reanimate or bring in like a double strike prowess Gear Hulk that can just win you the game off of those stats, right? And then you can use it to disrupt your opponent as well. Second place on the standard challenge for March 7th was Gruul Leyline by Its Time. And if we compare this one to the list that was in the Pro Tour in week 2, we can see that they dropped the Snakeskin Veil, the Callous Sellsword, and 4 copies of Monastery Swiftspear to bring in an additional mountain, as well as the 4 copies of the Manifold Mouse and 1 copy of Overprotect. So, both having ways to kind of save your creatures, this one leaning more heavily into the mouse package instead of the haste, right? So this is going to be worse against Wraths, where your Manifold Mouse is not able to immediately attack. So the best of 3 sideboard, we've got 1 less Ghost Vacuum, we've got 1 less Dreadmaw's Ire, we've got 2 less Burst Lightnings, as well as 2 Manifold Mouse have been removed as well, because we're playing them in the main. And instead we're playing the 4th copy of the Lithmanic Barrage. This obviously helps out against white and blue archetypes. It's good against, Esper Self-Bounce and Azorius Blank. We're also running the 3rd copy of the Pop Hatch formation, and this gives us some artifact or enchantment hate or creature with flying hate. And then we've got the 4 copies of the Obstinate Baloth, and this is a way to punish the Hopeless Nightmare in Esper Self-Bounce, Liliana, anything like that that's attacking the hand. Just allows you to play it out for free. All right, first place on March 8th was Esper Self-Bounce by Arg. And if we compare this one to the second version that I talked about last week, we can see that they dropped a single momentum breaker to bring in a island. And the best of 3 sideboard has no changes. So basically a rerun from last week. So in second place for the March 8th was Gruul Mice by Jack Pays. And if we compare this one to the Pro Tour, this is not the Leyline version, this is the Gruul Mice version. So the other one was like the Leyline was bringing in more of the mice synergies. So this is kind of like, yeah, one's running the Leyline, one's not, right? So if we compare this one to the Pro Tour as well, which also had a Gruul Mice strategy or archetype instead of just the Gruul Leyline strategy, there's subtle differences between the two. This one is dropping a Torch the Tower. It's dropping a Soulstone Sanctuary, a Forest, and an Obliterating Bolt, and a Witchstalker's Frenzy to bring in the 3rd copy of the Questing Druid, running an additional Restless Ridgeline, and bringing in the 4th copy of the Screaming Nemesis. This does better against mono red and other Gruul strategies, does worse against like Esper Self-Bounce and Go for the Throat. And we're also bringing in a 3rd copy of the Pop Hatch Recruit, which kind of offsets that. This is worse off against the aggro matchups, better off against a single point interaction. And then we're bringing in the 2nd copy of the Burst Lightning. So the best of 3 sideboard here, we're dropping a Lithmanic Barrage, the Questing Druid, 2 copies of the Sentinel of the Nameless City, and 1 copy of the Screaming Nemesis, as well as 1 Witchstalker Frenzy to play a Pyroclasm. This one's useful for the go wide strategies like Boros Convoke, Jeskai Convoke, mono white tokens. You can use it in the mirror matchup against other Gruul decks, mono red, that sort of thing. We've got 1 additional copy of the Obliterating Bolt, and this one is for anything with problematic 4 toughness. So Enduring Curiosity, well, it exiles that one. That one, it was good against the Sentinels that were being run for the mirror match. Yeah, there's a couple of sticky threats that are good to have the option to remove with exile. And same thing with the Torch the Tower. Allows you to exile a target. It's useful against other like Heartfire heroes in the mirror match and such. And then we're having 2 additional copies of the Sunspine Lynx. This one, you're bringing it in against Esper and Domain, any of the 3 colors or more strategies. Then Sunspine Lynx really punishes that. And we saw a spike in Domain since it took down the Pro Tour. So I think the Sunspine Lynxes are relatively well positioned as a 4 of. And then we also have the 4th copy of the Pop Hatch formation, and that's partially due to how many people like to run this card against the Zur enchantment deck, or Domain Overlords, or whatever you want to call it. And we have three copies of, or three different versions of Esper Self-Bounce. So people were wondering if it was because there was no Esper Self-Bounce in the Pro Tour in the top 8. People were like, well, maybe it's not really that good. I think it's just fine. I think the archetype just got targeted in the Pro Tour, and we're seeing it pretty consistently performing well in the tournament scene. So I wouldn't give up on Esper Self-Bounce in best of 3. I'm less impressed with it in best of 1. So this one's Esper Self-Bounce by Venom 1. It took down first place on March 8th because there's 2 tournaments on Saturday. If we compare this one to the first version of last week, we can see that they dropped a Destroy Evil and the Bottomless Pool to bring in the Go for the Throat and the Defiled Crypt. And what we're seeing happen in Esper Self-Bounce here is we've got some builds that are running the Optimistic Scavenger and some that are not. And the third version that we'll talk about here shortly is kind of going, like, bringing the two together. And so it's being rebuilt with since it was teched so heavily against in the Pro Tour, we're seeing some innovation to kind of bring it back to life, right? So the Defiled Crypt is better against the other mirror match where you're expecting to have more removal that's non-exile that you can then bring your creature back with the Defiled Crypt. And the best of 3 sideboard, if we compare this week 3, is dropping a Destroy Evil, Rest in Peace, the 2 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts, the 1 Defiled Crypt, 1 Kaido, and 1 Shrouded Shepherd to bring in the 2 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. And this is going to help out against the, aggro decks. We've got the Lorn of the Third Path coming in here to give us some artifact hate, and 2 pest controls. And this also helps out with any of the token generators, any of the things that are creating the large board states with mana value 1 or less. And then we have 2 copies of Spell Pierce, and I like this one against anything that has a sweeper, right? So like if you're up against Domain and you're expecting that Sunfall, it's nice to be able to bring in the Spell Pierce to protect your board so that you can aggro them a little bit more effectively. Second place on March 8th was taken down by Mono Red Aggro by Manila Chow, and they were in the top last week as well. So if we compare it to their list from week 3, we see that they dropped a Rockface Village to bring in a 4th copy of Screaming Nemesis. And also note the running the 2 Soulstone Sanctuaries instead of the 3, which I think is probably going to be where we land instead. I think we're going to land in best of 3 there, and I think we'll see that reflected in best of 1 as well. So the best of 3 sideboard, we see they kept it largely the same, dropping the Furnace Punisher to bring in a 1 copy of the Ghost Vacuum. And this is to help out against the in graveyard strategies, Azorius Oculus, even the graveyard the Golgari Self-Mill from the Pro Tour saw a little spike. Azorius Omniscience, that sort of thing. And the Furnace Punisher was like running a 5th copy of the Sunspine Lynx, helped you out against Domain. But hopefully we're seeing a little decrease in the amount of Domain from the hype. All right, and we've got the 3rd version of Esper Self-Bounce. This one was by Sneaky Masato. Took down first place on March 9th on the Sunday tournament. And if we compare this one to week 3, we can see, so the second version didn't have the Optimistic Scavengers. The first version did, and the Optimistic Scavenger is here, but we've dropped one. We've also dropped Kaido, Bane of Nightmares, and we've dropped the Bottomless Pool, and we've dropped the 2 copies of the Mockingbird to bring in an Island, the Momentum Breaker, and 3 copies of Stock Up. And so Stock Up was one of those cards that, like, it's being seen. You're seeing it in Domain, you're seeing it in Azorius Omniscience, you're seeing it in Esper Self-Bounce. Like, if you're in blue, everybody's wanting to play Stock Up, and the price on this card went up like 10 times its amount, right? It went from like $1 to $10 or whatever it was after the Pro Tour, right? And so, like, this is one of the strongest divinations that we've had ever, and it maybe it reads worse than it actually plays, but it's been pretty impressive. So definitely check it out. And then the best of 3 sideboard, we've got we dropped 2 copies of the Destroy Evil. We dropped 2 copies of Rest in Peace. We also dropped 2 Sheltered by Ghosts and 2 more No More Lies. And some were running the Spell Pierce, some were actually running the straight up Normalize last week. And then we've got one less Kaido in the sideboard as well, so we don't have the option to lean more heavily into the Kaido strategy. And then we've got one less Shrouded Shepherd, so we're not using that as the cheap sweeper. And instead we're bringing in Duress to hate on Control. We've got a second copy of, bringing in 2 copies of Lauren of the Third Path to give us some artifact and enchantment hate. And then we've got the 2 copies of Dreams of Steel and Oil, and this one is also a way to hate on artifacts. And then we've got the 2 copies of Pest Control in the sideboard as the cheaper sweeper than the Shrouded Shepherd, just going for the exile. And then we have the 4th copy of the Stock Up if you're in a non-aggro matchup where you can afford to run all 4 copies of the Stock Up. And we've got ourselves kind of a new archetype. So Arne's Azorius Control build definitely put Azorius Control back on the map. They went 9-1, so they didn't actually make the top 8 for the Pro Tour, because for the Pro Tour you have to go 10-0 for the top 8. And so, but they were close. They were like number 9, right? They were right on the edge. So Azorius Control by What Is Love took down 2nd place on March 9th, and is the first time that we're talking about it in Aetherdrift here. But if we do compare it to Arne's list in the Pro Tour, we do see that they went in a slightly different direction. So they're dropping a Plains, they're dropping 1 copy of the Day of Judgment, they're dropping a Blast Zone, they're dropping a Seachrome Coast, Jace, a Get Lost, Meticulous Archive, Ride's End down a copy, and then 2 negates out of the main, as well as the Change the Equation, and no Hornlock Whale, and no a darker, or one copy of the Darker Wastes. And they're bringing in an island, the Sunken Citadel, which can like activate your demolition fields and fountain ports kind of for cheap. We've got 1 copy of the Tishana's Tidebinder. This might be because we're seeing more Azorius Omniscience. I don't know. It's one of those that like this does block the triggered ability of the Invasion of Arcavios, and so like is a pretty decent counter to that matchup. But it's also good against like other, planeswalkers, silencing Jace and whatnot. We've got a Restless Anchorage for the Manland. We've also got 2 copies of Deduce, which is a crowd favorite. If your opponents are playing around your counter spells, then you can use the Deduce to create a map, draw a card and investigate, and then draw again. We've got the 1 additional copy of No More Lies, and then we've got the 3 copies of 3 Steps Ahead. So leaning more heavily into the counter spells than what we saw in the Pro Tour. The Pro Tour wasn't anticipating other Azorius Control, so as more Azorius Control comes into the meta, we'll see more counterspells come into the meta. Like I mentioned back in Best of 1, if it's a Control versus Control, it comes down to who has the most counterspells. And then we've got 2 additional copies of the Overlord of the Mistmoors and a Demolition Field. So the Best of 3 sideboard also got a pretty substantial rework. So we were dropping the 2 Tishana's Tidebinders. We still have 1 in the sideboard here. And then we've got Obstinate Baloth was ditched from this one, which we've already got the Wiltleaf Liege that we can actually play, so I like that. We've also moved the 2 Overlord of the Mistmoors from the sideboard to the main. And then we've got 2 less Dissection Tools. And Dissection Tools was a way to kind of bring Lifelink into this deck. And what we do see that we didn't see was so we had an additional copy of Devote Decree, which allows us to exile a creature or planeswalker that's black or red. The one that comes to mind immediately for me is the Liliana. Liliana, hating on the hand, has been a classic way to counter Azorius Control. But let me know in the comments below where you think, what target are you looking for when you play the Devout Decree? Always love hearing back from you guys. And we've also got a 2nd copy of the Negate coming in for the other Control matchups. We've got the 4th copy of Jace that we can bring in if they are weak to that strategy. And then we've also got the 2 copies of Elspeth Smite, which should bring in against aggro. Kutzel's Flanker you can bring in against aggro as well, but is primarily brought in as a 3rd copy of the Rest in Peace. And it is my preference. I like running Rest in Peace and then a Kutzel's Flanker instead of 3. But that one's kind of up to you. And then we've also got 1 copy of the Authority of the Consuls, which helps out against the aggro matchup as well. So thank you, as always, to listening to my ramblings. We actually got there 45 minutes in without I had a 10-minute long start on my rant. So Whew, we got there. um, Again, thank you everybody who's been a part of my community. I've been feeling a little bit burnt out doing this. I don't know, so there's always ups and downs, right? And like, I don't know. It's just one of those that's like, as I get older, as I get closer to 40, it's hard to justify this amount of time put into a hobby. And I had a dream that maybe it was something that was going to be more than a hobby. So maybe I'm gonna run it through. I think this might be my last year, but we'll see how it goes, right? Like if by December it looks like maybe I'm actually going to be able to do this as a justifiable hobby, then sure. But I'm not sure that I can continue to do it for another 5 years. It's just taking up too much time, right? But I really enjoyed the time that I have been doing it. I've enjoyed the people that I've met, so I'm not, I don't have any regrets, right? It wasn't wasted time, but it's been wonderful to share with everybody my love for my favorite game, right? So really, it's priceless in that sense. But I may have to step back a little bit. I don't know. I'm always torn because I feel like if I apply myself more, then I have a higher chance of actually making it happen. And then other times I'm like, well, maybe I'll just strictly treat it as a hobby and just do the meta review every Monday, right? But I like the community deck tech. I like the more involved process. It's just it's tricky, right? So thanks for listening to my problems that and my thoughts on Magic every week. And I will see you all. Let's see. Tomorrow is the community deck tech post. Like if you want me to look at one of your decks, look for the community tab, look for the community deck tech tomorrow. I'm gonna try to get the gameplay video because I feel like I should at least like run those out this week and next week, and then we probably won't see very much of me until Sunday, where I'll cover the meta breakers. Yeah. So take care, everybody. Good luck on the ranked ladder, and good luck in your RCQs. And I will see you all on Sunday. Take care.